Okay, we're back. We're back. And if you're following me, I mean, this is the. Whoa. Oh, I got a little feedback. We're listen, okay, so let's stop these two channels. Okay, so if you have a question, ask a question, and I'll prolong the thing. I don't know if that was me or the thing, but here's the book, Pale Fire, Vladimir Nabokov. Check it out. I'm up to page 57 here, and the commentary. The commentary is the majority of the book. It's maybe 100 and or almost 200 pages. And most of the book is the commentary by Kinbote. The poem is very short. The poem is very. I don't know if the poem is great poetry, but it's interesting. It makes a lot of references to his other books. I mean, like John Shade. I mean, he's a little bit like as if Timothy Panin, Humbert Humbert, or wrote poetry or something like that. It's like it's and it seems like it's referring within the poem. It's referring to the writing of the poem. It's really a hyper aware poem. It's I mean, he talks about he lost his parents and he was raised by Aunt Maud, but I mean, it's real. It's very general. So I'll read a little bit of each. There's four cantos, so let's read just what goes on. Okay, so I read this one before. I was the shadow of the wax wing slain by the false azure in the window pane. I was the smudge on the ashen fluff, and I lived on, flew on, in in the reflected sky, and from the inside too, I duplicate myself, my lamp, an apple on a plate, uncurtaining the night. I'd let dark glass hang all the furniture above the grass, and how delightful when a fall of snow covered my glimpse of lawn and reached up so as to make the chair and bed exactly stand upon that snow out in the crystal land. Retake the falling snow, each drifting flake, shapeless and slow, unsteady and opaque, a dull dark white against the day's pale white, an abstract larches in the neutral light, and the gradual and dual blue as night unites the viewer with the view, and the morning diamonds of frost expresses amazement, whose spurred feet have crossed from left to right the blank page of the road, reading left from right in the winter's code, a dot, a arrow pointing back, repeat, dot, arrow pointing back, a pheasant's feet, torque-weighted beauties, sublimated grouse, finding your china right behind my house. Was he in Sherlock Holmes, the fellow whose tracks pointed back when he reversed his shoes? So yeah, like Sherlock Holmes is like one of the only references to something kind of pop culture. There isn't very much. I mean, besides his life, and there's very little kind of references. I mean, there was a bit of something else here. I mean, he wrote this in the '60s, so I mean, maybe we can get to it. Let's just this kind of too. Okay, so let me just get back to. Okay, so the author of this poem is John Shade, an American poet and literature professor at Wordsmith. He refers. I think there's two colleges next to each other. The poet recalls his youth as a prospective, philosophically minded child. He was orphaned in infancy and raised by his dear, bizarre Aunt Maud, a poet and a painter. As a child, Shade delighted in the optical illusions made possible by the plate glass window in the living room. He would duplicate himself, the lamp, an apple on a plate in the window reflection. More spectacularly, he would see all the living room's furniture hang above the grass. The same optical illusion draws a bird to its death. Shade identifies himself with the shadow on the wax wing slain. Though he also lived on, flew on in the reflected sky. Shade recalls his youthful delights in all colors, even in gray, and his photographic memory. He also occasionally returns to the present day, still living in his childhood house. He sees a phantom of his little daughter swing in the yard. His daughter Hazel is dead. This is revealed in Canto 2. The poet recalls with his early disillusionment with religion. My God died young. He found fascination in the beautiful natural phenomenon, but he compares those beautiful sights to the illustrated paper lining a birdcage. For we are most artistically caged. He also mentions his awkwardness as a youth and his lack of athletic ability. He recalls a childhood experience of what seems to have been a seizure. There was a sudden sunburst in my head. The sunburst of light gave way to sublime blackness. The spells or seizures continued daily for one winter. Then the episodes stopped, but the wonder lingers and the shame remains. The novel Pale Fire is a book of mirrors, and Pale Fire, the poem, is likewise fascinated by reflectors. As a young child, the poet was fascinated by mirror image likeness of the living room, and he would duplicate himself looking at his reflection in the window. Shade identifies himself not with the waxwing slain, but it's with its shadow. The shadow lives on in the reflected sky after the bird dies. In this way, the shadow seems to be the bird's ghost, but it could also be the bird's image in the artwork. The reflected sky is the world seen in the work of art, like the reflected room hanging above the snow. Thus, from childhood, Shade has been interested in quasi immortality of artworks, perhaps as a defense against the brief mortal lives. The combination of beautiful couples makes the reader wonder how seriously to take the poem by the fictional Shade. Is the poem just something convenient to hang Kinbote's tail on, or is it a work of art in its own right? Thus, the poem involves readers in the novel's themes of mirror, shadow, shades, ghosts, and forcing the reader to question the validity of the work as art. Yeah, yeah, that's what I say. So, okay, so on to Canto 2. So let me read a little bit of Canto 2 here, which is a longer, and so it kind of changes tone here a little bit. I guess he's kind of looking back. Let's see how we doing time here. Okay, so pretty short. Okay, so Canto 2. There was a time in my demented youth when somehow I suspected the truth about survival after death was known to every human being. I alone knew nothing. And a great conspiracy of books and people hid the truth from me. There was the day I began to doubt man's sanity. How could he live without knowing for sure what dawn, what death, what doom awaited consciousness by beyond the tomb? And finally, there was the sleepless night when I could decide to explore and fight the foul, inadmissible abyss, devoting all my twisted life to this one task. Today I'm 61. Wax wings are berry pecking. A cicada sings. So he's kind of he's looking back. He's kind of the second part's a little bit more philosophical. And let's see. Oh, okay. So Canto 2 is more written on his 61st birthday. He ponders life and death and the afterlife. He speaks about the death of two people close to him, his aunt Maud and daughter Hazel. At age 80, Maud suffered some kind of paralysis and had difficulty speaking. Shade contemplates the decay of both the body and the mind. He ponders illogical aspects of belief in the afterlife and wonders if heaven is really so unlikely a possibility. Shade then turns to the story of his wife. They've been married 40 years now, and the poet still speaks fondly to her. Come and be worshipped, come and be caressed. Shade recounts the life and death of his daughter, Hazel. She was born looking like Shade, which Shade regrets. In the school plays, other children were cast as elves and fairies, while Hazel was Mother Time, a bent charwoman, house cleaner, with slop pail and broom. He recounts her loneliness and awkwardness, her school prizes, and her love of wordplay. The night of Hazel's death, she goes on a double date. It is late winter, almost spring. She is in her intended blind date. Pete Dean pretends to have an appointment and abandons Hazel. Not wanting to be a third wheel, Hazel takes the bus alone. Unexpectedly, she gets off on at the town of Lockenhead. The poem switches focus between Hazel's actions and those of Shade at home who are watching TV and waiting for her. They watch a show about the cause of poetry. Shade is mentioned as usual just behind one oozy footstep, Robert Frost. Robert Frost was a 20th century American poet. After 11, the Shades switch the TV off that night while the Shades wonder where she is. Hazel steps off the reedy bank into a crackling, gulping swamp and sinks. Shade considers theories about Hazel's death. She might have tried to cross the lake, or she might have gotten lost, or she might have committed suicide. Shade is certain which one it was. I know, you know. The two deaths bookend the cantos, and they're each other's opposite. Maud dies of an illness in old age, but Hazel dies in her youth of a misadventure or despair. Deaths pain Shade, but in their separate ways. Ma's death represents the succession of generations. The old die and the young take their place. With the death of his only child, Shade has no more successors. He was orphaned when young and now childish in old age. Maud's death occasions the poet's present day questions about the afterlife. What moment does resurrection choose is a question about age. Will the old and paralyzed Maud be as immortalized as old as paralyzed? This is a question about memory. Will she be always be for Shade as she was at her death? The corresponding questions about Hazel and the afterlife do not come until Canto 3 because Shade ends Canto 2 with the death of Hazel. Okay, so that one's, I think that's the longest. And then Canto 3 kind of, I mean, I don't know where, should I read? It, it kind of starts out in this kind of weird, has this weird starting. Canto 3. Uh, Lift lifeless tree, you're great, maybe Rabelais, the grand potato, IPH, a lay institute, I, of preparation, P, for the hereafter, H, or if, as we called it, big if, engaged me for one term to speak on death, to lecture on the worm, wrote President McAlber, you and I, and she, the mirror taught, moved from new Y to U shade in another higher state. I love great mountains from the iron gate of the Rem. Shackle house we rented there on one saw a snowy form so far, so fair that one can only fetch a sigh as if it might assist assimilation. So yeah, chapter kind of departs. The other one was looking back. This one kind of goes to this kind of lecture he did. Okay, so Canto 3, Shade recalls being employed to lecture on death for one semester. That's why this poem's a little goofy, you know. It's like, okay, so in one, he's talking about how his parents died when he was young and he was raised by Aunt Maud. And then in the second one, it's about the death of his daughter and the death of Maud. And then the Canto 3, he's talking about lecturing about death and stuff. So it's Shade notes the acronym IPH can be pronounced if. So yeah, the question of life of the question of life after death is a big if. Shade also alludes to the last words of 16th century French writer Francois Rabelais. On his deathbed, Rabelais is supposed to say, I go seek the great perhaps. In French, Rabelais' words are le grand poète, or as Shade comically pretends to mistranslate, the great grand potato. Throughout Canto 3, Shade focuses on the great, on the big if or life after death. Shade recalls IPH gave people advice about reincarnation. It also advised widowers on what to do upon meeting two former wives in the afterlife. He notes the Institute had no advice to give someone facing execution. Shade sums up his time at IPH. That tasteless venture helped me in a way. He learned what to ignore in his survey of death's abyss. Thus, when his daughter later died, he knew there would be nothing. No self-styled spirit would wrap out her pet name. While giving a lecture on why poetry is meaningful to us, Shade loses consciousness and falls down. His heart has stopped to beat and did not start again for several minutes. Um, he has an experience of the afterlife. I did not know that I had crossed the border. In the afterlife, he sees a tall white fountain. His doctor is skeptical. He could have had any mental experiences in his state. Shade protests, but doctor, I was dead. The doctor says, not quite, just half a shade. Shade reads about a woman, Mrs. Z, who also died, saw a white fountain, came back to life. He drives 300 miles to visit her, but is disappointed. She brushes off his question about the afterlife, instead chatters about how honored she is by the visit of such a great poet. An idiotic social call, Shade calls the visit. Later, the writer of the article about Mrs. Z, Jim Coates, reveals his article contained a misprint. Mountain, not fountain. Italics added, did not share Shade's vision of the white fountain after all. So the advice IPH, whatever the hell that is, gives form a catalog of the absurd consequences of life after death. A belief in reincarnation means believing one could come back as a young or invulnerable toad. A belief in eternal life after death means that social embarrassment of encountering two wives. Eternal life also brings a peculiar phenomenon of a changeless child who never grows up. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's like a problem. Uh, I mean, these kids that died like in 6 months. I mean, do we go to heaven and see them? And the are they people yet, or are we still going gaga goo goo? Since Shade wrote the poem, he seems to be lampooning the idea of the afterlife. But Nabokov wrote Shade in the poem too, and is perhaps skewering the absurdities of religious belief. But he could be also be making fun of the secular yet quasi-religious institution IPH with its half-religious notions. In this, the IPH is similar to civil. She tells Kinbote she has developed a religion of her own. It is perhaps neither belief nor unbelief that offends Nabokov here, but mediocrity of spirit. The so this comes here. The doctor doubts Shade died. You know, he just might have passed out first or fainted. He doubts Shade's mind was lively enough in his comatose state to entertain visions of fountains or mountains. Then he qualifies Shade's statement, but doctor, I was dead, to the doctor Shade has been more like half dead and a half ghost, just a half a shade. So, yeah, that's pretty hilarious. Is that the end? Oh, no, here it is. Okay, so what is that? That's okay, so that's Canto 3, where he's lecturing people on death in Canto 3. So Canto 1, he's just talking about his life, his being an orphan raised by his aunt. And then the two, he's recalling the two deaths, the major deaths in his life. And then 3, he's lecturing about some kind of weird at some kind of college or something. Okay, so in Canto 4. Okay, so how are we doing for time? This is okay. So we're up to about 20 minutes. So this is a lot longer. Okay, so let's just read the beginning of this. Now I shall spy on beauty as none has spied on it yet. Now I shall cry out as none has cried out. Now I shall try what none has tried. Now I shall do what none has done. And speaking of this wonderful machine, I'm puzzled by the difference between two methods of composing. A, the kind which goes on sorely in the poet's mind, a testing of performing words, why he is soaping a third time one leg, and B, the other kind, much more decorous when he is studying. He is in his study writing with his pen. So he's kind of talking about, and this one he kind of this starts out like talking about the poetic creation. It's like it's pretty crazy. So Canto 4. Shade announces his ambitions for his poetry or the poem. He will spy on beauty as none has spied on it yet. He will cry out. He describes two writing methods. Method A goes on in the poet's mind. A lot of my poetry is like that. And method B involves pen and paper. Then he describes scenes from his everyday life, including an episode of sleepwalking and his habit of shaving in the bathtub. He catalogs the things he loathes, including jazz, progressive schools, and music in supermarkets. He also loathes Philistines, Freud, Marx, fake thinkers, puffed up poets, frauds, and sharks. But he praises the affection and support of his wife, Sybil. Shade wonders if his affection for certain poetic techniques is based upon a feeling of fantastically planned, richly rhymed life. There is a harmony like rhyme between his private universe and the verse of Galaxies Divine. He also feels he understands existence, or at least a minute part of his existence, only through his art. The poem couplet ends on the line 999, an unrhymed, odd numbered line, trundling an empty barrow up a lane. Okay, so Shade's poem and Kinbote's commentary often seems like light years apart. However, in this canto, Shade's poem foretells the narrative of the commentary. He comes up with the idea of man's life as a commentary to abstruse finished poem, note for further use. He is perhaps telling himself to note this for further use, or the italicized text is a note he made. He will not be able to make any further use of this idea, but this is the form of Pale Fire, the novel. In Pale Fire, one man's life, King Charles, unfolds, and the commentary to an unfinished poem. Shade's poem is missing its final line. However, Shade's idea is also broader than the story of King Charles. His idea about man's life, not a man's life, thus every life in all humankind might be the pendant or elaboration of some poem still being written. It is clear that Shade thinks of the universe as a poem, designed, written, rhymed, even though he believes there is no God. He sees a parallel of rhyme between his life and the shape of the universe. He writes, if my private universe scans right, so does the verse of the galaxies divine. Here he uses the language of prosody to study the study of poetry's rhythm. When a line of poetry scans right, it fits the rhythmic pattern set for it. The poem verse of the galaxy's divine also scans. According to Shade, he suspects its rhythmic pattern is an iambic line. Thus, Shade's poem has a divine form. At the end of the poem, Shade uses an image foreshadowing his death. The last lines are, some neighbor's gardener, I guess, goes by trundling an empty barrow up the lane. The barrow, of course, is the gardener's wheelbarrow, but a barrow is also a grave, rather a mound of earth or stones heaped over a dead body. The barrow in the poem is empty because Shade is not yet in it. He is still alive at the end of the unfinished draft. The line Kinbote supplies for the unfinished couplet will complete the poem and put shade in the barrow in the grave. I was the shadow of the waxwing slain. Okay, so so there's the poem. It's kind of an unusual poem, and but you get kind of idea of like shade and and Kinbote. Um, he's going to come and talk about what this poem means, and as his best friend, supposedly. Okay, so that's it for today. That took a while, 25 minutes. Okay, so since this is the longest thing, I'll probably it'll be a few days before I come back for part three. So part one was the foreword. Part two was the actual poem. Part three, I think it's going to be part three. Is the commentary, and and then part four will be the index, and then if there's a if I need some more explaining to do, I'll come back to it. Okay, thanks for listening. It's Alexander Lawrence, the Portable Infinite, and talking about literature, and we're talking about Pale Fire today, is and reading it and trying to understand the poem. So read the first 50 pages and see my next stream, maybe on what's today, possibly on Thursday or Friday.